North Atlantic. February 1942. The sea is black and heaving, with white caps catching what little moonlight breaks through the overcast. Somewhere in that darkness, a convoy of merchant ships is making its way westward. 23 vessels, thousands of tons of fuel, food, and military equipment, escorted by destroyers moving in tight protective arcs around the column. On the surface, the convoy commander believes he is following a route that no enemy knows. The routing signal was encrypted. Before it left port, the code tables were current. The procedure was correct. He is wrong. Hundreds of miles away, in a low building near the German city of Flensburg, a young naval signals officer is pulling a headset from his ears. He is handing a decrypt to his supervisor. The paper shows the IEB convoy's waypoints, its exact route across the Atlantic, plotted in plain German. The convoy does not know it is already dead. There is a front in every war that never makes the newsreels. No infantry advances across it. No artillery fires along it. The men who fight on this front do not charge hills or storm beaches. They sit in low brick buildings, in converted farmhouses, in basement rooms smelling of cigarette smoke and machine oil. They wear headphones, and they listen. They stare at columns of letters, and they search for patterns. This is the signals war, and in the early years of World War II, Germany was winning it. The German military had understood something that most of its enemies had not yet. Information was a weapon. The ability to hear what your enemy was saying, to intercept his orders before his own commanders received them, to understand his intentions before he acted on them. That was worth divisions of men. It was worth fleets of ships. This understanding did not appear overnight. It had been developing since before the First World War, refined through the brutal laboratory of that earlier conflict. By the time Hitler's armies crossed the Polish frontier in September 1939, Germany entered the war with a mature, deeply resourced, and remarkably effective signals intelligence apparatus. Most of their enemies had not yet understood what they were facing. What followed over the next several years was one of the most consequential hidden contests of the 20th century, a war fought entirely in the electromagnetic spectrum, over cipher tables and intercept stations, over mathematical weaknesses and procedural errors, a war where the prize was not territory, but knowledge, and for a period that overlaps with some of the worst Allied disasters of the war, Germany held the advantage. But every cipher can be broken, and every intelligence advantage can be lost. The story of how Germany read the Allies' communications and then faced a machine it could never crack is not simply a story about technology. It is a story about arrogance, institutional blind spots, and what happens when the tools you trust most become the instruments of your own strategic failure. Understanding how Germany built this capability requires going back not to 1939, but to the aftermath of the First World War. The German military spent the interwar years under conditions of forced limitation. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the German army of its size, its armor, and much of its institutional infrastructure. But restrictions on manpower and weapons could not restrict thought. In the Reichswehr, the small professional force that preceded the Wehrmacht, a generation of officers quietly preserved and expanded the intelligence doctrines that had proven their value in the previous conflict. Signals intelligence, Nachrichtenaufklärung in German, was treated not as a secondary function, but as a core operational capability. Officers who had served in signals roles during the First World War wrote doctrine, trained personnel, and argued for institutional investment. By the mid-1930s, as Hitler's rearmament program began restoring German military power, the signals intelligence services were ready to expand. They had doctrine. They had trained cadre. They had a clear sense of what signals warfare could accomplish. By the time the war began, the Wehrmacht had organized dedicated listening units, the Horchkompanien. These were not improvised attachments. They were trained, equipped, and operationally integrated with the commands they served. A Horchkompanie could identify enemy unit dispositions by tracking radio traffic patterns. It could establish order of battle through directional finding, intercept operational orders if the encryption was weak, and feed that intelligence directly into the planning cycle of the commanders above them. Each listening company was assigned to an Army-level or Corps-level headquarters. Their reports fed upward through a dedicated chain to senior intelligence staffs at OKH, the Army High Command. Beyond the battlefield units, the Wehrmacht's centralized cipher bureau, known by the abbreviation OKWCHI, handled strategic, intercepts, long-range collection, and cryptanalytic work. It employed mathematicians, linguists, and signals engineers in a systematic attempt to break the codes of allied nations. And then there was the most successful branch of the entire German signals intelligence enterprise, the branch that inflicted more strategic damage on the Allied war effort than any other, the branch that, at its peak, was reading almost every significant communication passing through one of the most critical British cipher systems in the war. This was the B-Dienst. The Beobachtungsdienst, the observation service, was the Kriegsmarine's cryptanalytic and signals intelligence arm. It had existed since the First World War, and, like the rest of German signals intelligence, it had survived the interwar period under careful institutional stewardship. By 1939, it was ready. The B-Dienst operated out of a headquarters in Berlin and maintained intercept stations along the German and Norwegian coastlines. Wherever signals from the North Atlantic and the British Isles could be reliably heard, the B-Dienst was listening. Its analysts were not generalists. They had spent years studying British naval communication procedures, cipher habits, and the subtle patterns that even encrypted traffic leaves behind. Their primary target in the early years of the war was the British Naval Cipher, and they were extraordinarily successful. British naval communications were encrypted using a series of code books and cipher tables that the Admiralty believed were secure. In principle, they were, if the cryptographic discipline was perfect. But perfect discipline is difficult to maintain in wartime. Exhausted signals officers processing hundreds of messages a day under operational pressure make errors. Those errors accumulate. Messages get repeated in different cipher versions. Traffic volumes reveal patterns even when the content is hidden. The B-Dienst's analysts found the holes. By 1941, they had achieved partial breaks into what the British called Naval Cipher No. III. This was the primary cipher used for coordinating Atlantic convoy operations. As the year continued and the volume of intercepted traffic grew, those partial breaks deepened. By early 1942, the B-Dienst was reading convoy routing signals, the critical messages that told merchant vessels and their escorts exactly which route to follow across the Atlantic. The implications were not abstract. They were immediate and lethal. When a convoy routing signal was sent from the Admiralty to the ships at sea, it specified the exact waypoints the convoy would follow. The timing, of course, changes. The areas designated as dangerous due to known submarine activity. It was the operational blueprint for getting the convoy across the ocean safely. And within hours of its transmission, German naval headquarters were reading it. Convoy routing was the central mechanism of Atlantic convoy defense. The British had developed a sophisticated system for routing convoys around known U-boat concentrations. A system that depended entirely on the enemy not knowing where the ships would be. When the Germans could read the routing signals, the system was inverted. Instead of routing convoys around submarines, The Germans could route submarines directly into their paths. The numbers from this period are striking in their brutality. Through 1942 and into early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached a level of intensity that threatened to sever the supply line between North America and Britain entirely. Merchant ships were going down faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. U-boat wolf packs were finding convoys with a regularity that baffled Allied commanders, who could not understand how submarines were achieving such precision. Part of the answer, a significant part, was the B-Dienst reading their mail. Convoy officer in this period would have found it impossible to understand the source of his difficulty. The routes were changed. The escorts were increased. New tactics were developed. And yet the wolf packs kept finding them. There was no obvious leak, no obvious failure. The cipher looked secure. The procedure looked correct. But the B-Dienst's analysts had found a way inside that no surface inspection of the cipher system could reveal. This was what mature signals intelligence looked like at its operational peak. Invisible, precise, devastating. On the ground, across the deserts of North Africa and the vast steppes of the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht's Horchkompanien were adding their own layer to Germany's signals advantage. In North Africa, Rommel's operational tempo depended significantly on what his signals units could hear. The Afrika Korps operated in a theater where distances were enormous and communications were constant. Both German and Allied forces relied heavily on radio traffic to coordinate movement across hundreds of kilometers of open desert. That radio traffic was interceptable, and the Germans were intercepting it. The British Eighth Army in its early incarnation suffered from serious communications, security problems that the German signals units exploited systematically. Voice radio communications at lower tactical levels were sometimes transmitted in the clear or under minimal encryption. Higher-level traffic was encrypted, but the volume and patterns of that traffic revealed a great deal. Which units were preparing to move? Where the logistical focus was shifting? Which sectors were active and which were going quiet? The Germans were also benefiting from something even more precise. An American military attaché in Cairo, Colonel Bonner Fellers, was sending detailed assessments of British intentions, capabilities, and weaknesses back to Washington. His reports were being sent via a cipher that the Axis had broken. German intelligence was reading them almost as fast as Washington. Rommel himself referred to this source simply as his good source. It was a source that gave him a level of operational insight into British planning that no amount of battlefield reconnaissance could have provided. No patrol, no aerial photograph, no captured prisoner could tell him what those signals told him. In the East, the scale of signals operations was even larger. The Soviet military in the early phases of Operation TYPEX Barbarossa had serious communications discipline problems. Officers broadcast operational orders over unsecured radio nets. Units violated radio silence in ways that revealed their positions and compositions. A signals culture that had not yet adapted to the demands of modern interceptable warfare. The Wehrmacht was listening, and it was hearing almost everything. German Army intelligence was tracking Soviet order of battle through signals analysis across hundreds of kilometers of front. The Horchkompanien were mapping Soviet unit dispositions, tracking reserve concentrations, identifying command nets that linked headquarters to frontline units. The men doing this work were not field operatives behind enemy lines. They were radio operators and analysts sitting in mobile signals vans, headphones on, turning dials with practiced precision, finding the right frequency, logging the signal strength, the procedural patterns, the fist of the operator, the unique touch that identified a specific transmitter. Building a picture of the enemy from the electromagnetic trace he left behind. It was painstaking work, and it was enormously valuable. But this picture had a shadow that few in German signals intelligence were willing to examine too closely. The Germans believed their own cipher machine, the Enigma, was unbreakable. They had mathematicians' arguments to support that belief. They were wrong, but that truth would remain hidden for decades. For now, the advantage appeared to lie with Germany. And then the Americans arrived. The United States entered the war in December 1941 with its own signals intelligence traditions and its own cryptographic expertise. These capabilities had been built through the interwar years by a small community of American military cryptographers working with limited resources and largely without public recognition. The most important of these was a cipher machine the American military called the SIGABA, also designated the ECM Mark II, the electric code machine. It had entered service before Pearl Harbor, and its deployment accelerated sharply after the American entry into the war. The SIGABA was, by any measure, a remarkable cryptographic achievement. Unlike most cipher machines of the era, which used a single bank of rotor wheels to scramble messages, the SIGABA used a complex arrangement of 15 rotors split into two separate groups, a cipher group and a control group, with the motion of the cipher rotors driven by the output of the control rotors in a pattern that was, in practical terms, close to random. That design decision mattered enormously. Most successful cryptanalytic attacks against cipher machines during the war depended on predicting or exploiting regularities in how the rotors moved. The SIGABA's designers had effectively eliminated that entire class of attack. The machine was large, heavy, and mechanically complex, not suitable for front-line field use. But for strategic and operational traffic at headquarters level, it was deployed across American communication networks. German signals intelligence noticed the new cipher traffic immediately. Beginning in early 1942, the WWII's analysts began encountering intercepts of American military communications that they could not read. The traffic had the structural characteristics of enciphered machine text, but no attack was finding a way into it. The standard cryptanalytic approaches that had worked against British codes were not producing results. The analysts began a systematic study. The WWII was not an amateur organization. It employed some of the finest mathematical minds in Germany, men who understood the theoretical foundations of cryptanalysis as well as anyone in Europe at the time. They collected intercepts of SIGABA traffic and subjected them to every form of analysis available. They searched for repeated patterns in the ciphertext that might indicate predictable rotor behavior. They looked for operator errors, the human mistakes that had opened up breaks in other cipher systems. A message sent twice under different settings. A stereotyped beginning that a skilled analyst could guess. The first toehold for an attack. They found nothing. This was, in itself, a form of information. The absence of exploitable patterns told German analysts that the machine was operating in a genuinely high-entropy manner, that its output had statistical properties very close to those of a truly random sequence. This was extraordinarily difficult to achieve in a mechanical cipher system. Most machines produced output that was random-looking but contained subtle statistical fingerprints that accumulated over large volumes of traffic. The SIGABA produced no such fingerprints, or none that the WWII could find with the analytical tools available to it. Meanwhile, the Americans were exercising strict operational security around the machine itself. The SIGABA was classified at the highest level. Its physical size made it difficult to capture. Strict protocols governed its use. Even the people who operated it were not given the full picture of how it worked. There were no captured machine specimens for German engineers to examine. There were no defectors who knew the internal design. There were no operator errors of sufficient magnitude to open a mathematical window into the cipher. The Germans could see the shape of the communication. They could not see what it said. That was worth something. Traffic analysis, the study of communication patterns without reading the content, could reveal which headquarters were talking to, which circuits were becoming more active, which were going quiet. The Germans were skilled at this, but traffic analysis without content was a shadow of the full intelligence picture. The actual substance of American operational traffic, the troop movements, the logistical builds, the planning signals, remained completely closed to them. The Americans were not the only ones presenting the German codebreakers with a hardened target. The British had their own cipher machine, the TYPEX, which was in wide use across the British military and at Allied command levels. It was a development of Enigma's basic design principle, but incorporated significant improvements that made it substantially more resistant to the cryptanalytic approaches German analysts understood. The WWII had studied TYPEX intercepts. German analysts understood it was a multi-rotor cipher machine, broadly similar in concept to Enigma, but with key differences in its wiring and operational procedures that made systematic penetration extremely difficult. Combined with strict British indicator discipline and frequent key changes, it held. The higher-level British cipher traffic, the traffic that carried strategic and operational decisions, remained largely protected. And then there was the one-time pad. The one-time pad is, in mathematical terms, an unconditionally secure cipher. It works by combining each character of a message with a truly random character from a pad of key material. Key that is used exactly once and never repeated. If the key is truly random and used only once, the cipher cannot be broken regardless of how much time or computational power is applied. There are no patterns to find. There is no statistical leakage. The mathematics simply do not permit an attack for the most sensitive Allied communications, traffic between the highest levels of government and military command. One-time pad systems were increasingly employed as the war continued. German analysts encountering these intercepts were not facing a poorly designed machine cipher. They were facing mathematical perfection. The combination of SIGABA for American operational traffic, TYPEX for British military traffic, and one-time pads for the highest strategic communications was creating something that had not existed in the early years of the war. A broad sector of Allied communications that was simply dark to German intelligence. The transition was not sudden. German signals intelligence did not go from perfect vision to complete blindness overnight. It was gradual, a progressive darkening. Through 1942, the B-Dienst was still reading British convoy routing. The Horchkompanien were still producing useful tactical intelligence on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. But the direction of change was unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. The Americans were deploying SIGABA traffic more broadly. The British were tightening their communication procedures following an internal review that recognized the vulnerabilities in Naval Cipher No. 3. That review led to the replacement of the cipher in June 1943. The movement toward more rigorous cipher discipline across all Allied services was accelerating. Each upgrade cost the German signal services a part of their visibility. The replacement of Naval Cipher No. 3 was particularly significant. By mid-1943, the B-Dienst's hard-won access to British convoy routing signals was gone. The new British cipher system, Naval Cipher No. 5, did not yield to the analytical approaches that had cracked its predecessor. The B-Dienst continued working against it, but the results were dramatically reduced. The window that had illuminated the Atlantic for 2 years had closed. For the men at B-Dienst's Berlin headquarters, this was not simply a professional setback. They had understood, better than almost anyone in Germany, how significant their access to British convoy signals had been. They knew what their work had meant for the Battle of the Atlantic, and they could see what losing that access would mean. The U-boat campaign was already under severe pressure. The Allies had deployed long-range air cover over the mid-Atlantic gap, improved depth-charge technology, and developed better anti-submarine tactics. Convoy losses were declining. Now the routing intelligence that had helped U-boats find their prey was also degrading. The convergence of these pressures proved catastrophic. In May 1943, the same period when the cipher transition was occurring, the Kriegsmarine lost 41 U-boats in a single month. It was a rate of attrition that was operationally unsustainable. Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. The B-Dienst was not the only cause of the Atlantic reversal, but they had been a component of what success the campaign had achieved, and their diminishing effectiveness was a component of its failure. The strategic effect of German signals intelligence's degradation was not confined to the Atlantic. Into every theater where German operations depended on accurate intelligence about Allied intentions, the progressive hardening of Allied communications had consequences that accumulated through 1943 and into 1944. In the Mediterranean, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Sicily, German commanders were working with an intelligence picture, far less complete than what they had enjoyed a year earlier. The combination of SIGABA traffic, improved British cipher procedures, and the tight operational security surrounding Operation Husky left German planners genuinely uncertain about where the main Allied blow would fall. They were not entirely blind. The famous Operation Mincemeat Deception, the planting of false documents on a corpse that washed ashore in Spain, contributed significantly to German confusion about Allied intentions. But the signals intelligence picture, which might in earlier periods have partially corrected or complicated the deception, was no longer capable of providing clear answers. The Sicily landings on July 10, 1943, achieved a degree of strategic surprise that would have been far more difficult if German signals intelligence had still been reading Allied operational traffic at full capacity. On the Eastern Front, the WWII Army was also undergoing its own signals revolution. Communication procedures were tightened. More secure cipher systems were deployed with Allied technical assistance. Stricter radio discipline was imposed across the force. The Soviets were learning. The procedural errors and plain text transmissions that had characterized the early chaotic months of Barbarossa were disappearing. The cumulative effect of all these changes came to its sharpest point in 1944. In the months of planning and deception that preceded the Normandy landings, Operation Overlord was the most significant Allied military operation of the entire war. Hundreds of thousands of men, the largest amphibious fleet in history, a landing on a specific stretch of coastline that, once committed, could not be adjusted if the Germans were waiting in strength. The operational security surrounding Overlord was extraordinary. The deception operation, Fortitude, was sophisticated and carefully maintained. But Fortitude would have been far less effective if German signals intelligence had been able to read Allied operational planning traffic. If they could have confirmed that the main invasion was heading for Normandy rather than the Pas de Calais, the deception would have collapsed before it achieved its purpose. German intelligence was operating on deduced inference rather than direct access to Allied communications. They were reading the shape of the war from what they could observe: unit movements, shipping activity, logistical patterns. The content of Allied planning signals transmitted over SIGABA circuits and through one-time pad channels remained completely closed. This was not a small limitation. It was, for the German intelligence picture, a hole through which an entire army could march undetected. And it did. There is a dimension to this story that adds a particular sharpness to its historical meaning. While The WWII was failing to break American and British high-grade ciphers. The opposite process was occurring in England, in almost complete secrecy. At Bletchley Park, a team of mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and analysts had broken the German Enigma machine as early as 1940. They were reading German military traffic with steadily increasing fluency through the years that followed. The operation, codenamed Ultra, represented one of the greatest intelligence coups in the history of warfare. The Germans, who had built their communications security on absolute confidence in Enigma's mathematical strength, were transmitting their intentions through a cipher the Allies were reading. While the B-Dienst was losing its window into Allied convoy routing, Bletchley was reading the U-boat command's operational traffic. While German commanders in the Mediterranean were working from an incomplete intelligence picture, Allied commanders were reading German responses to their movements in near real time. While German signals analysts stared at SIGABA intercepts and found nothing, British and American commanders were reading Enigma traffic that revealed exactly how much, or how little, the Germans understood about what was coming. The asymmetry was profound, and it was structural, not accidental. The Germans had built a remarkable signals intelligence apparatus. They had staffed it with talented people and given it institutional support and operational integration that most other nations' equivalent services could not match. They had achieved genuine and consequential successes. The B-Dienst's penetration of Naval Cipher No. 3 was a real intelligence triumph, operationally significant in ways that cost Allied lives and ships. But at the level of strategic command, the level where the war's outcome was ultimately decided, the German intelligence advantage had been narrow and time-limited. Their opponents were not standing still. The Allies were improving their cipher security, deploying harder targets, tightening procedural discipline. And in the most consequential cryptographic contest of the war, the contest over Enigma, Germany was not the attacker. It was the victim. It is worth pausing on the men who actually did this work. Not the commanders, not the strategists, but the analysts. The German cryptanalysts who worked against SIGABA traffic were not failed professionals. They were not intellectually outmatched in any simple sense. They were working with the analytical methods available to their time and their institution, applying those methods rigorously to a cipher system that had been designed specifically to resist them. When months of work produced nothing, the professional response was not to declare defeat and move on. It was to refine the approach, collect more traffic, try different analytical angles. The mathematics of cryptanalysis are unforgiving. A cipher either yields to available methods or it does not, and no amount of institutional pressure changes the underlying mathematical reality. These analysts knew, as their work extended through 1942 and into 1943 without results, that they were encountering something different. They wrote reports about it. They documented the properties of the SIGABA traffic that distinguished it from everything else they had seen. They were, in their careful professional way, recording the shape of a wall they could not climb. On the other side of the Atlantic, the American signals officers who handled SIGABA traffic had been trained in strict operational security procedures. They knew the machine was classified. They knew not to write key settings down incorrectly or leave printed material unsecured. They knew not to send the same message twice under different settings. They knew not to use predictable message beginnings. The security of SIGABA was not just mathematical. It was human. The discipline of the people who operated it was part of the system. The Americans had learned from their own earlier cryptographic failures that a mathematically strong cipher operated with poor discipline could still be broken. The machine and the procedures had to work together. The Germans never captured a working SIGABA machine. They never found an operator who had violated procedure in a way that created an exploitable pattern. They never found the combination of circumstances, the repeated message, the stereotyped text, the procedural shortcut that was needed to begin a meaningful attack. The wall stayed up. By late 1944, the German signals intelligence picture was a fraction of what it had been. 3 years earlier, the B-Dienst still existed. The Horchkompanien still operated. The WWII still employed its analysts and collected its intercepts, but what it could see had shrunk dramatically. Lower-grade traffic remained partially accessible. Tactical communications, administrative channels, the inevitable procedural errors that occur in any large military organization under combat stress. This produced a stream of useful but limited intelligence, adequate at the level of individual engagement, inadequate at the level of theater strategy. At the strategic level, where the war's outcome was being decided, German intelligence was largely working from inference and observation rather than direct access, and inference, without confirmation, is just an educated guess. Hitler's decision to hold back armored reserves on D-Day, believing the Normandy landings might be a diversion preceding a larger strike at the Pas de Calais, reflected exactly this kind of strategic uncertainty. It was a decision made in a darkened room, a room that had once been lit. The story of German signals intelligence in the Second World War is not a story of simple failure or simple success. It is a story of how an advantage, real and carefully built over years, was progressively eroded by the adaptive responses of the opponent. The Germans were good at this. Better than most accounts acknowledge, the B-Dienst's penetration of British convoy ciphers was a genuine intelligence achievement, one that contributed to a level of Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic that at certain points genuinely threatened the supply chain, keeping Britain in the war. The Horchkompanien were effective tactical tools. The WWII was a capable and well-staffed institution, but capable institutions can be outpaced. The introduction of SIGABA represented something that German signals intelligence could not overcome, not because they were incompetent, but because the machine had been designed with exactly the kind of rigor that closes the doors that less careful designs leave open. The irregular stepping mechanism, the complexity of the rotor arrangement, the stringent operational discipline that accompanied deployment. These things worked together as a system. Not any one feature, but the combination. The British TYPEX held as well. The one-time pad systems used for the highest communications were impenetrable by definition. The progressive hardening of Allied cipher discipline across the board, from convoy routing to field communications to strategic planning, created a cumulative wall that German signals intelligence could not breach at the levels that mattered most. What this ultimately produced was a strategic blindness that accumulated at exactly the moments when clear vision was most needed. The major Allied operations of 1943 and 1944, Sicily, Overlord, the great drives that followed, were all planned in a signals environment that had been hardened substantially from the vulnerable early war period. The Germans could observe the preparations. They could not read the intentions. That distinction between observation and knowledge is the core of what signals intelligence provides. Observation told German commanders that the Allies were building up force. Knowledge would have told them exactly where that force was going. Denied that knowledge, they had to guess. And they guessed wrong about the decisive moment of the war in the West. The Germans entered the war with supreme confidence in their own cipher security. In Enigma, in the procedural discipline of their signals services, in the mathematical arguments, their experts had offered for why their communications could not be penetrated. That confidence was not entirely unreasonable. It was based on real analysis. It simply turned out to be wrong. The Allies were reading the German High Command's operational traffic through the critical years of the war. German signals intelligence, despite its genuine capabilities, was never able to achieve equivalent penetration of Allied high-grade communications. The Cipher War ended the way the larger war ended, not with a dramatic final battle, but with a grinding asymmetry that finally became insurmountable. The Germans were listening. They were skilled. They were determined. They were working against the right targets with the right tools. But the cipher had changed, and they never found the key.